reimagining allyship and methods in decolonial participatory research praxis. So for the dialogue today, these are the four main things we are going to focus on. We're going to try and just understand in plain language what is decolonial research praxis. We're going to discuss the boundaries and limitations of participatory research, because as much as we try to incorporate our thinking and our inclusion of everyone in the research process, there are points where we don't hit the nail on the head when it comes to inclusivity at every point in the research project. I'm going to present our theory around reimagining allyship, and then I would like to share with you some innovative and appropriate methodologies to promote allyship in our studies. So here is where we're going to stop for the first time. And I would like you to please go to paulev.com/LYNNH163. You can either open up a new tab on your computer, or you can use your cell phone. Cell phone might be a bit easier for you to just type in. And I want you to respond with one word. What does the term decolonial mean? So we'll just wait for those responses to come in. So remember to pop in your name, and your name won't be displayed on the screen, so don't worry. Okay, there we go. Doing things better, being respectful, inclusive. So I know that there are only a few of us on the call, so I won't wait too long. But yes, absolutely. So when we think around decolonial, we're thinking about how we are currently doing things and how can we do them better. We have to think about respect for all. We have to absolutely think about our mindsets, because you cannot do decolonial work when your mindset is unchanged or not ready to do the decolonial work. Thinking about boundaries, changing things, freedom. And here it's freedom for all involved in the research process, participants, researchers. So let's break down. Thank you, all of you, for your responses. I'll make sure to capture those. I would like to break down the terminology into its individual works. Decoloniality as a definition refers to the logic, the metaphysics, the ontology, and the matrix of powers created by the massive processes and the aftermath of colonization. So at every point on the conceptualization of research and how we approach the paradigms we use in our research, we have to think around how do we deal with the situation that colonization has left, and how do we approach our research paradigms from a decolonial perspective. Research is the systematic investigation into and the study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. And praxis is the practice, one accepted custom distinguished from theory. So it's a way of doing. So if we think about all these together, praxis is a way of doing, research is a systematic investigation into, and decoloniality is how we approach the paradigms, then the term decolonial research praxis then is the practice of systematically investigating phenomena from a paradigm that takes into account the logic, the metaphysics, the ontology, and the matrices of power created by the processes and in the aftermath of colonization. So it's a big mouthful. In simple language, we're basically saying, how do we do research in this post-colonial era? How do we do research in a way that gives everyone the freedom to express themselves? How do we do research in the way where all thoughts, perspectives, opinions, beliefs are valued? And how do we do research when no one's voices are silenced? It starts with turning the world upside down. So if you look at this map, and I've hidden a little bit of it, I've turned the map completely upside down. And what you see at the top over here, this is the bottom of Africa. And I flipped it and put it on the top, and I put Europe at the bottom. Because we really just have to turn the world on its head for us to start to make sense of how we produce knowledge. Decoloniality is not a means to reject the scientific, medical, social, or ethical advances of the modern era. Rather, it's a way to explore how colonization, modernity, capitalism, and most recently, neoliberalism has displaced an array of modes of living, thinking, and being. Decoloniality can reveal the dark side of modernity and how it's built on the backs of others that it racialized, erased, and or objectified. Therefore, decoloniality is a method and a paradigm of restoration. It aspires to restore, elevate, renew, discover, and acknowledge and validate the lives, lived experiences, culture, and knowledge of indigenous people, people of color, and colonized people, as well as to decenter hetero, cis-normative, gender hierarchies, and racial privilege. I'm going to say that first part again. It aspires to restore, elevate, renew, discover, and acknowledge and validate the lives, lived experiences, culture, and knowledge of Indigenous people. Decolonial approaches and movements seek to consider ideas, social practices, histories, identities, and beliefs as part of a myriad of means of production of knowledge, but also we understand that producing knowledge and living it are not separate. In decolonial research praxis, we seek to learn and make visible the connections between knowledge, social practices, and social. Decolonization is a process which engages with imperialism and colonialism at multiple levels. For researchers, one of those levels is concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values which inform research practices. Thinking through decolonial research praxis is definitely a change in the way we think about and how we conduct research. So when we look at the research process, there are various steps involved from conceptualization to dissemination. We think about a project and we think this is a great idea, or there's definitely a gap for this research, or I have a question and I really need to find the answer for me to proceed with something else. So we start thinking through this problem and the research problem. We start rationalizing what the problem is. Then we start thinking through the methodology and the protocols, and we develop a proposal. In doing that, we may or may not have a research team if you're not doing it independently. And with your research team, you then apply for your ethics approval or approval through the health department, or institutional approval. Once you receive your approvals, you then conduct your field work, whichever methodology you may choose. And from that, you collect your data, which you then analyze. And once you've analyzed your data, you start making sense of it and interpreting it. And once you've interpreted, then you write the report. And from the report, you may choose to publish your data and then disseminate it, whether it's online, through a talk that you do, a webinar, blogs, Twitter, however you choose to share what you found. Now, when we think through decolonizing research methods or research praxis, at what point in this research process do we start thinking around decolonization? Is it only at the fieldwork stage? Is it only at the dissemination stage? Is it only at the conceptualization stage? When we think about the research process and decolonization, it actually takes into account each of these steps. Even before I think about a concept, I already need to start thinking through, am I doing the decolonial work? It's your ethical responsibility as a researcher to conduct decolonial research. We cannot keep duplicating, replicating, and creating new ways of knowing through old traditional methods that was at the disadvantage of others. With that conversation, I'd like you to go back to your poll EV, because we're going to be focusing now on participatory action research or participatory research. Can you please answer for me? Have you ever been involved in a PAR project or a participatory project? Right. 100% of you have been involved in a project, and that's amazing. So I'm going to, should I give it a couple more seconds? See if there's something for us in the chat. Angelina says yes. Thanks, Angelina. Okay, so let's move on. So that's wonderful. I'm so glad that I have other PAR researchers on this call with me. And if you think about your PAR project, I want you to think through your project while we are speaking, because I'd like us to really engage in conversation after this around our projects that we are doing. So throughout this presentation, please think about your projects, and if there's things that stick out for you, write them into the chat. Let's engage with them afterwards. Participatory research practice have strongly been promoted in the context of critical emancipatory research. PR for short is often done with an intention to achieve positive change. The important feature of PR is that it's done by or with participants rather than to or on them. The traditional model of PR usually follows the steps of engaging communities and participants, identifying issues and goals, gathering the data, interpreting the data, and disseminating the findings. PR builds on these steps while evaluating the outcomes of the actions taken from the findings of the research. The claim that an active involvement of the participants in research projects has an empowering effect has been a strong motivator for researchers in social sciences to start investing in collaborative research practices. From this perspective, the establishment of a trustworthy, solid relationship with participants is crucial for a successful rollout of the PR projects. Solid relationships form the ultimate basis for what we conceptually understand as PR, a gathering of people with a shared interest and a mutual responsibility to achieve their goals with an underlying set of relationships that are reciprocal in nature. Stakeholders are mutually invested, and the idea of equal position is quite central. It implies that researchers accept that their own position changes from someone who controls the research process to someone who becomes one stakeholder amongst many that work towards the common goal of raising awareness and building a relevant knowledge base. This is the best case scenario. PR promotes the idea that people from community of interests themselves should be engaged in the project and study their own situation or life circumstances in a permanent dialogue with the researcher. If you look at the picture on the screen, the researcher is the one holding that clipboard. The stakeholders, the communities are walking alongside the researcher. They are invested in the same goal. They are walking towards the same direction. This is the ideal. In reality, and now really think about your own project, researchers are often bound by project-related resources and timeframes, as well as predefined methodological standards that more often than not promote a phased and rather linear rollout of the participatory process, moving from a defined research interest over data collection, analysis, interpretation to dissemination. Those steps that I showed you before, we follow those steps as much as we can, and we follow them sequentially. But in reality, when we work on the ground with a lot of stakeholders, it doesn't fit into that neat sequential pattern that we would like it to fit. But as a participatory researcher working from a decolonial paradigm, we must be flexible in how we approach our research. We can't be bounded by commitments of time, funding, waiting for committees, especially if the need is urgent in the field, authorizes managers. You can't buy this equipment, or it's not in the scope of your budget, but the community is saying that they need it and this is what they want at the moment. You know, all these conflicts and tensions arise in your participatory research and you feel stuck. I know I feel stuck sometimes between what I need to do in the community and what the rules are and the policies in the academic institution. And in reality, we have to juggle these, and we can't get that ideal scenario of equal stakeholders in the research process. And what happens is that in reality, we can leave little room for the consortium of participants and researchers to negotiate time, space, conditions of the project. And this can become, again, where the researcher holds all the power, even though they approach the project from a very decolonial paradigm and perspective. The dynamic complexity of PR processes demands an open ending and preferably allows for stakeholders to move ideas, thoughts, actions, tactics, and relationships beyond the project's deadline. And it opens opportunities for stakeholders belonging to different worlds to join forces and push forward towards change for better of mankind. So when we think through participatory research, and what I would like you to do now in the chat box is help me think through what these boundaries and limitations are of participatory research when we're thinking through it from a decolonial perspective. Some of them which I've listed here is that we become inflexible to which point we want to include participants in our research study. We might conceptualize our project, we send it for ethics, we get approval, and we say that we're going to include participants in the data collection. But then when it comes to the analysis, it again becomes our project. And we may only have a participatory project when we think it's beneficial. And we don't really adopt the true essence of a participatory framework. So please, if you think of any other limitations, please add them in the chat. I'm going to move forward in the meantime. So this is the paper I was talking about, which should be in print fairly shortly. It's called Reimagining Allyship in Decolonial Research Praxis is the name of the paper. Rethinking Time and Space. So at the top of the diagram, what we have is two worlds. We've got the community world, which is the one side of the infinity side, and on the other side, we've got the academic world. If you can imagine that as an elastic band, and if you put the elastic band over both your hands and you pull it apart and you twist it, you would have these two separate circles. When we untwist the elastic band here and untwisting it, we then come up with one big circle where all the actors are in. And ultimately, ideally, this is where we should be as participatory researchers in what we are calling the third sphere. Can everybody hear me? I see somebody's message in the chat that the sound is not coming through.
Yes,
the sound is working clearly on my side.
Okay, we continue. So what we're looking at here is an untwisting of these bands, an untwisting of boundaries and institutions to create this one sphere. Now, realistically, we come as academics, researchers, practitioners, and we come into communities. And we want to conduct these participatory projects. At that point, you're not yet in a third sphere. The third sphere isn't something that naturally happens. It's something that must be created. How do you create this? You create it by getting to know the community. Ideally, you have community partners that work with you on the project. And when you come into a space where you are going to now collect the data, you have already set the scene for how that is supposed to happen. You have already built a relationship with the participants. This is something that I am working on within my own project and experimenting with, because usually in ethnographic research, what
because previously it wasn't your phone. When I clicked on, sorry. Okay.
in ethnographic research, usually you will go into a community, you will get to know the community, people will get to know you, and you become a citizen of that space while you're collecting the data. But eventually you leave and you analyze your work and you publish. In this scenario that I'm presenting now, when you go into communities, you go in as the researcher, you go in as yourself, but what you say is, in this space we are creating, we are going to think through this project together from start to finish. So this comes with proposal writing, approvals, the research team, the questions that you're going to ask, how you're going to investigate the study, everything about it. You are going to do that in consultation with all the actors or a representative of every actor group before you start this project. When it comes to data collection, you have to be flexible in what you are investigating. So I struggled for a long time with the ethics committee around my research interviews, because what I said was, I don't yet know what I'm going to ask them, because we're going to decide together what we're going to investigate. So even the protocol I submitted was a protocol that said it's open to whatever we're going to investigate as a group together. I just want permission to approach the participants. So if I get to my participants and I say, look, we would like to explore how you've experienced growing up being HIV positive. What is it that you want us to explore? They can tell me that they want to explore things about the future, they want to explore relationships with their parents, they want to explore the community. It's completely up to the participants what we are going to explore. How we're going to collect the data is also completely up to the participants. We will decide together whether we are going to record, take photos, do an interview, whether they're going to write essays. I'm not making any decisions at this point for my methodologies of my study, but I'm seeking ethics approval for all the methodologies, all the possible scenarios that might occur. When it comes to how we analyze, so in my study, I'm producing a documentary on the whole process. The participants will be trained in how to produce a video, and we are going to work together on the video production. We are going on a camp, so we're going away for the weekend, out of the community, just us with the producers, and we're going to be working on this document in our third space. When it comes to the interpretation and the paper, they will have a chance to contribute to the paper. So we're going to write together if they choose to and want to. So not all participants may want to be involved at every point. And then when it comes to dissemination, it's the participants that are going to the Congress, not me. It's their names that go with mine on the publication. It's their posters that they create that become my infographics, not the ones I create. It's the local newspaper that the infographics go in, not the journal. So it's really about rethinking how participatory can you really be and reimagining. And it's been a struggle. I struggled for a year and a half with my ethics application because people wanted clarity on what exactly I'm doing. The approach I've taken is for broad ethics approval to approach the participants. And then once the participants and I have clarified the protocol, we will submit an amendment to the ethics committee. So that's just a bit of an example of my story with rethinking time and space in a PR project. And one of the theories that we are working on, and this is from the paper that my colleagues Chloe and Karina Nus and Sarah Coemans and I have been working on together. So I'd like to pause again and ask a different question. Earlier we asked, what is decolonial? Now I'm going to say, what decolonial methods can you recommend? This is before we even get into the methodologies. So just think about your own project and think about methods that create those feelings that you said before: freedoms, rights, equal. What methods have you used or can you think of that promote decolonial methods? Yes, I'll just wait a couple of minutes for you to submit. So I see focus groups. Here's some in the chat. Appreciative inquiry, storytelling, music. So I'm going to come back to those at the end because I'm not very far with the presentation. And I'd like to come revisit these photo voice. I'm going to just pop them in the chat. We've got embroidery. Okay, thanks everybody. Keep them coming in the chat box. We will revisit them. So here are some examples that I've used before in my work that really helped me with communities and with, I would say in these projects, I experienced feeling like a stakeholder amongst many instead of as a researcher participant relationship. So one of the best ways, I think, especially for novice researchers, to start getting hold of this research methods that are inclusive, that really get to the essence of what people want to say, is photo voice. Very easy for students to do and to learn about, and especially now with many people having access to cell phones to collect the data. And in this type of research, you know, you collect the photos, people tell their stories through pictures. Art is a really expressive medium. It's really such a great tool for you to get to know your participants and for your participants to know you. But it's not a matter of saying, here, participant, here are all the materials. I want you to do this artwork. It's about getting your hands dirty with the participant, drawing together, playing with clay together, creating collages and photos and abstract paintings together. That is what connects you with the participant. That is what you become that is when you become allies. We also think of video diaries. So this is something I used experientially with 2 or 3 participants. So every evening we take a little clip about what I am thinking around a project or a topic, and I would send it to the group chat. And every evening, the others would do it as well. In the end, it felt like we were having conversations with one another, and it was so easy to talk about almost anything. And those boundaries of researcher participants started disappearing because we were taking personal connections with one another. And I know a lot of you that work, especially in our African context. I know Nezizwa was presenting her work a week ago, where she spoke about connecting with the kids in a project. You can't be rigid in how you approach the work in our context. We can't think that because this is how it's always been done and these are the rules that have been given to us by the research gods, we can't go beyond. We can break boundaries, we can create new. We can become the masters of our own ways of creating new knowledge. We think about drawing, network mapping. So let me just scroll through. This was really a fun activity. This was a visual board that we did with a group of young moms and dads. And we were talking about gender roles in the house. And in this group, we really struggled with literacy. Not everyone could read or write. So what we did was everyone had stickers and we would read out one word at a time, and people would put the stickers where they thought it was blue for dads and pink for moms. And we would put the stickers where we thought it was the dad and the mom's responsibility. The point of this exercise is that we weren't calling out people for what they didn't know how to do. Rather, the environment we created in the research sphere was that we are all equal here. We are all contributing to the conversation. And there's no focus on we're doing this because, sometimes it's hard to read. You don't even say that. It doesn't even feature. It's just we put a list together and now we're going to stick stickers on where we think it's mom and dad's responsibility. I, as the researcher, am very careful about what I say and how I make my participants feel in the context of my research. This is an example of community mapping. So in this study, we were looking at where young girls go. You can see this is a 2012 study. We're looking at where young girls go to receive help for their health. And when we were talking, I was never planning on doing a community map in the study. We were just talking and they were trying to describe, but they were struggling. And then we just started, I said, okay, let's draw the map. And then they started drawing the map. They did this all on their own. And it was so easy through art for them to make clear what they wanted to say. But also in terms of dissemination, this medium is much easier for people to relate to than a diagram that I might have done on the computer in black and white and with fancy colors. This is just so more data rich than something I could have produced. Body mapping. So the one on the right is from a study that we conducted. And here we were looking at sensors in the body and where people experience pain or trauma in the body. Very interesting, very intense work when you think through this type of methodology and people actually thinking about their own bodies. And it's amazing how the body recalls sense when you use this methodology. So I want to pause there for a moment around methods because I'd like for us to discuss that a bit more. And given that we are now in an era of the lockdown and the pandemic, it's still possible for you to do the decolonial work online. And when we think through that, we always come back to, but not everyone's on the internet and not everyone has a cell phone. But 62% of South Africans do have access to the internet. That's a large proportion of people. We're not always going to be stuck online or in a lockdown. But in the meantime, for those of you whose research has gotten stunted for the year or need to complete It is possible for you to do some of your work online and for you to revisit the field next year. There is a large proportion of people on the internet. Active internet users are 62%. Active mobile internet users are 59%, and this is between the ages of 15 to 65. In terms of how South Africans are accessing the internet over the mobile phone. So all of a sudden you start thinking around, how can I do this type of work over WhatsApp, Facebook, ethnography on Facebook, blogs. Facebook has introduced this new feature called Facebook Rooms where you can create these virtual labs. It's also possible for you to do your interviews, but then to make sure your participants know how to use the equipment, have the data to participate in the study, and no one's disadvantaged. Unless you can put those measures in place, I wouldn't suggest that you use it, because you are responsible for giving everybody an equal platform to participate in your research. And just for interest, as of January 2020, 89% of all South African internet users are on WhatsApp, YouTube, Facebook, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, Twitter. I was speaking to my sons a few days ago, and I asked them, I want to do a study with young people. What are the social media platforms I use? They are 14 and 16. And they said Instagram and Twitter. They don't use anything else. They don't use Facebook. They are just on Instagram and Twitter. Pictures is the way that we speak. So when we think around participatory research and decolonizing it, we need to realize that participatory research processes are complex entanglements of relational and ethical paradoxes and imperfections. One such ethical paradox is that of decolonial research praxis. However, the ongoing work of decolonialism has much to be achieved. With major disparities in healthcare provisions and the compromised well-being of previously marginalized groups still evident, conducting decolonial research calls for reimagining epistemologies, or ways of knowing, ontologies, and methodologies. Decolonial research is about creating spaces that can enable allyship within the research process using flexible, adaptive, and creative methodologies, and moving beyond opportunistic and rigid times and spaces for participatory practice. Allyship is a central tenet in the design, implementation, evaluation, and dissemination of decolonial participatory research, and can be defined as a mutual search for understanding and potential transformation of life circumstances through investigation and argumentation, in the absence of coercive force or preset boundaries. In this webinar, we reimagine allyship in decolonial research practices and the methodologies appropriate to its conduct. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for joining me in this webinar. Thanks so much for joining me in this webinar. If you are interested in more of my work, please feel free to email me at lynnah@sun.ac.za. I look forward to hearing from you, or pop me a comment at the bottom of this video. Thanks so much. This is Lynn. Bye-bye.